flood is coming. God has decided.
God made a decision that would change the fate of humanity forever, and not everyone was saved. There are two types of beings that never set foot on Noah's Ark, and the reason is darker than you can imagine. Most people think they know the story of the flood, but what really happened has been hidden for centuries. Noah did not build the ark to save everyone, but to exclude those who had corrupted the whole world. Who were those beings that God decided to erase from the face of the earth with no possibility of redemption? The answer lies in one of the deepest and most disturbing mysteries of all biblical writing. To understand it, we must go back to a time when heaven and earth were forbiddenly intertwined. In Noah's days, the world was not simply evil. It was the result of a supernatural transgression. The fallen angels, referred to in the Bible as the sons of God, voluntarily abandoned their place in heaven. These fallen angels did not fall by mistake. They made a conscious decision to rebel against the Creator. Upon descending to the earthly realm, the fallen angels took on human form and sought the daughters of men. Genesis 6:2 confirms that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful and took them as wives. This union between fallen angels and human women was a direct violation of the established divine order. From that unnatural union between the fallen angels and the daughters of men were born unique and terrible creatures. Those creatures are the Nephilim, hybrid beings that belonged neither to heaven nor to earth, but to chaos. The Nephilim were physically imposing, with a superhuman strength that no ordinary man could match. But it was not just their size that made them dangerous. It was the evil that resided within them from the very beginning. The Nephilim filled the earth with violence, corrupting every corner of the world that God had created with love. Genesis 6:4 calls them ancient heroes, famous men, but their fame meant terror. Under the dominion of the Nephilim, humanity lost its ability to distinguish between good and evil. The Nephilim were not only violent, they controlled humans, pushing them towards total corruption. The whole earth groaned under the weight of the evil that the Nephilim had unleashed since their very existence. God observed all of this, and the pain he felt was deep because his creation had been completely perverted. Then God looked at humanity and saw that all the wickedness was great and that every thought was only evil. Genesis 6:5 reveals the state of the human heart at that time, corrupted to its deepest core. However, amidst so much darkness, there was a man who shone with a different light among the others. Noah was righteous, blameless among his generation, a man who walked with God in times of absolute corruption. Unlike his contemporaries, Noah did not yield to the influence of the Nephilim or the fallen angels. Noah had a choice and bravely chose justice when everyone around him chose evil. It was because of that integrity that God chose Noah as the instrument of his plan to renew all of creation. God revealed to Noah a devastating truth. He was going to destroy all living beings with a universal flood. The flood would not be an ordinary flood. It would be the ultimate instrument of divine justice on earth. Noah listened to God with faith and without doubt began the most monumental task that a human being had ever received. Building the ark would take 120 years, a period of time that tests the most solid and firm faith. During those 12 decades, Noah worked tirelessly while the world around him continued to sink into evil. The Nephilim watched the construction of the ark with disdain, unaware that their fate was sealed forever. The fallen angels who had begotten them could not foresee that the flood would end their lineage. Because God had made a decision that allowed no appeal, the Nephilim would never enter the ark. This is the exclusion that the biblical history records clearly, and that few take the time to reflect on deeply. The Nephilim, children of fallen angels and human women, were condemned before the first flood, not because God was cruel, but because the Nephilim were the very source of the corruption that was destroying the world. Allowing the Nephilim to enter the ark would have meant bringing poison inside the ship of salvation. The fallen angels also had no place in the divine plan of restoration, as they had betrayed their nature. God did not save the fallen angels because their rebellion had been deliberate, conscious, and without the possibility of return. There was a line that the fallen angels voluntarily crossed when they left heaven to descend to earth. That line separated obedience from transgression, and once crossed, the consequences were irreversible. Thus, the flood became the simultaneous judgment against the Nephilim and against the fallen angels who created them. When the time came, the animals began to enter the ark two by two, male and female, in perfect order. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 daughters-in-law also entered, fulfilling the command received with precision. Then something extraordinary happened that Genesis 7:16 records with a solemnity that still sends shivers today. It was God himself who closed the door of the ark, not Noah or any human being, but the creator of the universe himself. That divine closing of the door symbolized the end of all possibility of salvation for those who remained outside. The Nephilim, who had dominated the world with violence, suddenly found themselves without refuge before the flood. The fallen angels, who had defied the celestial order, were judged along with their monstrous offspring. The flood came with a force that the earth had never experienced and would never experience in that way again. The waters rose, covering the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits, approximately 8 meters. Genesis 7:20-23 coldly describes the end of all living beings that were not inside Noah's ark. The Nephilim, with all their superhuman strength, could not withstand the waters of the flood sent by the Creator. The fallen angels watched as their offspring was erased from the earth like dust from a clean surface. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark survived, exactly as God had planned from the beginning. The extinction of the Nephilim was not an accident. It was the direct consequence of having been born from fallen angels. However, the story of the Nephilim does not completely end with the flood, and that is what is truly unsettling. Centuries later, when Moses sent 12 spies to explore the Promised Land for 40 days, something happened. 10 of the 12 spies returned with a terrifying report that paralyzed the entire people of Israel with fear. They claimed to have seen giants in the Promised Land and asserted that these giants were the descendants of the Nephilim. Numbers 13:33 records their words, "We saw the Nephilim, and we were like grasshoppers in our own eyes before them." This testimony about the Nephilim generated a collective panic that would have devastating consequences for Israel. But 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, did not give in to fear or the exaggerated stories about the Nephilim. Joshua and Caleb trusted in the power of God and knew that no giant could stop the will of the Creator. However, the fear of the supposed descendants of the Nephilim was stronger than the faith of most of the people. God punished that unbelief by causing that entire generation to wander for 40 years in the Sinai desert. Only Joshua and Caleb, the only ones who did not fear the Nephilim, finally entered the Promised Land. The legacy of the Nephilim was so powerful that even their memory, centuries after the flood, instilled terror. This tells us something fundamental about the nature of the Nephilim and the power they wielded over the human mind. The Nephilim were not merely physical giants. They were a symbol of the evil that the fallen angels had brought into the world. Nephilim appears twice in the Bible, in Genesis 6:4 and Numbers 13:33, but its impact is huge. Every appearance of the term Nephilim in the sacred text is accompanied by catastrophic consequences for humanity. In Genesis, the Nephilim provoke the flood that nearly exterminates the entire human race from the face of the earth. In Numbers, the memory of the Nephilim triggers a crisis of faith that condemns an entire generation to perpetual desert. The exact identity of the Nephilim has been debated by scholars and theologians for centuries without reaching a consensus. Some argue that the fallen angels mentioned in Genesis were literally rebellious celestial beings. Others propose that the children of God were descendants of Seth, the third son of Adam and Eve, the righteous lineage. But regardless of the interpretation, the role of the Nephilim in the biblical narrative is undeniably central. The Nephilim represent the most extreme consequence of the transgression of the fallen angels against the divine order. And that transgression was so grave that it required nothing less than a universal flood to be eradicated from the earth. Noah understood, although perhaps not entirely, the gravity of what God was asking him to build. Noah's Ark was not just a boat. It was the boundary between the world corrupted by the Nephilim and the new world. It was the line that separated those who had walked with God from those who had followed the fallen angels and the Nephilim. The construction of the Ark over 120 years was also a period of grace, a final opportunity for repentance. But the Nephilim, with their hybrid nature born of fallen angels, could not repent of what they were. The fallen angels had made their definitive decision the day they left heaven, and that decision was irreversible. So the flood was not just a punishment, it was a cosmic surgery that removed corruption from the world at its root. Noah and his family were the core of the new beginning, the seed of a humanity that could choose good once again. Without the Nephilim, and without the fallen angels physically present, the world would have a real chance to renew itself. But, as history shows, human nature carries within itself the capacity for evil without needing the Nephilim. The deepest lesson of the flood and the exclusion of the Nephilim is not simply about punishment or divine justice. It is about the responsibility of every human being to choose the path of Noah instead of the path of the Nephilim. Noah wasn't perfect, but he chose to do good, while the Nephilim and fallen angels corrupted everything around him. That choice made him the link between the world that was destroyed by the flood and the world that was born afterward. The Ark of Noah is not simply a symbol of physical survival against the devastating flood that swept across the earth. It is the symbol that there is always a way for those who choose justice, even when the Nephilim dominate the world. The Nephilim, born of the fallen angels, believed that their power made them invulnerable to any consequence. But the flood showed them that no power born of transgression can survive against the will of the Creator. The fallen angels learned that leaving heaven to mingle with humanity came at a price they could not pay. And Noah learned that active faith, expressed in 120 years of constant work, is the only true answer to chaos. When the waters of the flood finally receded and Noah's Ark rested on Mount Ararat, something new began. Noah came out of the ark with his family and the animals, and the first thing he did was build an altar to thank God. The world was clean, free from the Nephilim, and the direct influence of the fallen angels who had begotten them. God then established a covenant with Noah, sealed with a rainbow, promising that there would be no other universal flood. That pact was also a recognition of Noah's faithfulness in the face of the corruption of the Nephilim and the flood. However, the question that has persisted through the centuries is one that theologians have yet to fully answer. Was it fair to exclude the Nephilim from the ark if they did not choose to be born from the union between fallen angels and women? The Nephilim did not choose to be what they were, but the evil they carried within was inseparable from their own nature. The fallen angels did choose freely to transgress the divine order and beget the Nephilim with the human daughters. Perhaps the exclusion of the Nephilim was, in a way, also a consequence of the decision of the fallen angels. The universal flood closed a chapter of sacred history with brutal clarity and no possibility of appeal. The Nephilim, the fallen angels, and all those who had chosen evil were buried beneath the waters of the flood. Noah, symbol of redeemable humanity, emerged from the flood to begin a new story on the renewed earth. The Bible does not give us easy answers about the Nephilim or the fallen angels who brought them into the world. It gives us, instead, a narrative that forces us to reflect on the consequences of every choice we make. The flood that wiped out the Nephilim and the fallen angels remains one of the most powerful stories in history, not only for its apocalyptic scale, but because at its center is the decision of a single man, that of Noah. A man who, surrounded by the wickedness of the Nephilim and the seduction of the fallen angels, chose to walk with God. That choice saved humanity, the animals, and planted the seed of everything that would come after the flood. The Nephilim disappeared in the waters, the fallen angels were judged, and Noah became the father of the new world. The story of the Nephilim excluded from Noah's Ark is ultimately a story about the power of choice. Each generation faces its own Nephilim, its own forces that threaten to corrupt what God has created. And in every generation, God seeks a Noah, someone willing to build their personal ark in the midst of the cultural flood. The question is not whether the Nephilim or fallen angels have power, because they clearly did in the days of Noah. The question is whether, like Noah, we are willing to choose justice when the world around us chooses chaos. The Ark of Noah closed its doors forever before the Nephilim, and the flood did the rest with absolute precision. God made the hardest decision in sacred history when he excluded the Nephilim and the fallen angels from the Ark. But that decision was also what made it possible for humanity to have a second chance after the flood. The Nephilim, born from the transgression of the fallen angels, were the price that the earth paid for that transgression. And Noah, born from the line of the righteous, was God's answer to that price with the hope of the renewed world. The flood that extinguished the Nephilim and judged the fallen angels continues to speak to us with the same strength as always. Because in every era of humanity, the struggle between the light of Noah and the darkness of the Nephilim continues unabated. God's decision to exclude the Nephilim from the ark was not an act of cruelty, but the definitive act of justice. A justice that recognized that the flood was the only possible remedy for such a deep wound in creation. The fallen angels had broken something fundamental in the fabric of reality by engendering the Nephilim with human women. And only the universal flood, with the salvation of Noah and his family, could restore that fabric to its original state. The story of Noah, the Nephilim, and the fallen angels is much more than a tale from a distant and misunderstood past. It is a mirror in which humanity can see itself and ask on which side it would be if the flood were to come today? Would we be inside Noah's ark, or outside of it alongside the Nephilim and the fallen angels who begot them? The answer to that question defines not only our faith, but also the quality of every decision we make in our lives. Noah built his ark for 120 years because he knew the flood would come, and that certainty sustained him until the end. The Nephilim, on the other hand, lived as if no flood could ever reach them, and that arrogance destroyed them. The fallen angels believed that their celestial nature would protect them from the consequences of their actions on earth. The flood demonstrated that no one, neither the Nephilim nor the fallen angels, is above the Creator's justice. Only Noah, in his simple and persistent faithfulness, found grace in the eyes of God in a world dominated by evil. That grace is the same that remains available to those who, like Noah, choose to walk with integrity every day. The exclusion of the Nephilim from the ark was the logical consequence of everything the fallen angels unleashed by rebelling. And the universal flood was God's signature in a world that desperately needed a true new beginning. Noah opened the windows of the ark after the flood and saw a dove returning with an olive branch in its beak. The dove signaled the floodwaters had receded, indicating the world was no longer under the Nephilim or fallen angels' control. It belonged to Noah, to his family, to the animals that survived, and to all the generations that would come after the flood. The Nephilim were excluded from the ark. The flood erased them, but their story continues to resonate in every living generation.